So I'm pretty sure I counted them correctly. I didn't choose the number. The game just that chose that's how many there are. Today I aim to answer some very specific questions. What's the difference between Drawstring Greases in vanilla and those in the DLC? Is it more worth it to spam a weapon skill, or should you conserve your FP and just use it once and exhaust the entire duration of the buff before using it again? These are questions I'm sure some of you didn't even realize you had or mattered. This also means we're only talking about the weapon buffs themselves and not whatever happens to be surrounding the weapon buff. I'm not ranking the entirety of the Bloodboon Ritual skill, I'm ranking the weapon buff that it gives you after using it. So this list might look a little fucked up in some parts, but hopefully most of it will smooth out as we go along. You know what I'm fucking sick of? Paper. Paper mail, paper checks, paper posters, fruitless attempts to embellish my living space with low-quality material, the futility and shame measured only by the abundance of tiny holes perforating my office walls. How does a two-dimensional object exist in a 3D space and still get in the way this fucking much? Just get a disc plate instead. Here, check this shit out. That's the sound of uncompromising durability. Displate has over 2 million different artworks on their website as a result of their partnerships with some of the biggest names in the business. Marvel, Elden Ring, Warhammer, Cyberpunk, popular anime like Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man, Castlevania, Yu-Gi-Oh!, fucking Disco Elysium. Okay, I wasn't expecting that one at all. If you're an artist yourself, you can even make and sell your own unique designs and illustrations. Each displate comes with its own set of magnet mounts that are ridiculously simple to set up, easily swappable, they don't shit all over your wall, and they've got some of the fastest delivery times in the business. They've also been putting a lot of time into this new type of poster called a Textra, which is the same metal base but with manually enhanced 3D effects and textures that make the details of the poster pop out even more. It looks fantastic for just about any design, obviously, but I think it stands out the most on like typography, especially like movie posters with a giant title, because the lettering on some of these will come out so defined that it just looks like it's suspended in space. If you're as sick of paper as everyone else, grab a couple prints yourself using the discount code RUSTY at store checkout. Number 69, Unseen Blade. It is staunchly impressive that no matter the context or subject matter, this sorcery consistently finds itself near or at the very bottom of every list it appears in. I don't think FromSoft even remembers they put it in. The microscopic list of advantages only seem to be PvP exclusive, in that it obscures the amount of reach your weapon may have in combat, but even still, this only works if the weapon has an exceptionally long reach that's enough of an outlier to be underestimated in the first place, like the pike or the Nagakiba. It's shamefully ironic that a sorcery meant to conceal your strategy fits into so few playstyles and weapons that using it can actually give away more than it can hide. Despite all the roadblocks, there's an extremely simple solution to fixing this. Just make it a unique buff. Being a weapon buff means it can't be used on infused weapons, nor can it be stacked with other buffs of its type. Two of the most obtrusive deal breakers this sorcery continues to suffer from. Number 68, the Bloodboon Ritual buff. Why? Why is this here? This would have straight up been better off just not even giving it a buff. This gives you 30 flat fire damage that's unable to scale with anything for 20 seconds. Well, more like 16 or 17 seconds because the buff is applied almost immediately after the first stab. And the skill on this bitch is like Lay's potato chips because you can never have just one, so you might as well just go on ahead and spasm out on that L2 for a few seconds until the full animation's done. This leaves you with around 13 seconds of uptime for 30 flat fire damage on a Great Spear, one of the slowest weapon categories available. This buff had to have just been busy work for an intern. That's the only explanation for why this is here. No change to bleed build up either. It's just fire damage. This is the litmus test for how well you were listening to the preamble. If you got past this part without any vehement disagreements, then I think most of us are going to be okay. Number 67, Drawstring Blood Grease. I cannot in good faith say Blood Grease is useless. I can say it's an unfathomably, sinfully terrible preference that takes barely an hour into the game to be eclipsed by an incantation half the starting classes can use without leveling, but Blood Grease still has a tiny niche with arcane builds who are too proud of themselves to run Seppuku, but not proud enough to, you know, not run an arcane build. Thing is, the standard Blood Grease still gives you a full minute of uptime, which does support consistent pressure with arcane scaling weapons. If I'm using a 15-second buff, I need to proc status on something right the fuck now. And 38 bleed per hit that only scales under certain conditions and for only 15 seconds just isn't gonna get that job done, unless you're making a conscious effort to build specifically around it. These are the types of people who run Resident Evil 4 with 150% resolution scaling because it keeps their house warm. Like, I can't objectively say you're doing it wrong, but like, fucking whatever. I'm moving on. Number 66, Mists of Eternal Sleep. Finding an easier way to complete a task that's already smooth and basic enough in process is something I think is just wasted effort that could have been used somewhere else. So me and the concept of Eternal Sleep are already having a hard time getting along. If something can be slept, the keys to its defeat are already jingling in front of your face waiting for you to grab them. You don't really need Eternal Sleep to make the process smoother. Against enemies that are resistant to sleep, you'll notice proccing the status becomes way harder due to Eternal Sleep weapons just having less innate buildup across the board, giving you a choice to make between the combat being completely uninvolved or downright fucking impossible depending on how resistant your target is to being slept. In other words, it's a piece of shit, find something else. Number 65 through 62, Vanilla Drawstring Elemental Greases. Now, let me explain why this is such a specific title. Drawstring Greases in the DLC were actually given a decent duration. Regardless of status or damage type, the DLC Drawstring Greases have a duration of 25 seconds. For damage purposes, this is a very significant difference, since this brings their total duration up to nearly 1/2 the length of regular grease buffs, whereas previously these items were only capable of a 1/6 of the duration. 10 seconds feels more paltry than it ever has before, and string becoming accessible in the DLC only really gives attention to the other DLC exclusive Drawstring Grease buffs that end up being both more potent and longer lasting. Everything has quickly been pointed against the vanilla Drawstring items in a way that makes them seem inconvenient and only marginally useful even in the best possible situations. Number 61, Euporia Vortex. This one ended up being extremely difficult to place because I started overthinking what was supposed to count as the weapon buff part of the skill. If I were to count the fully charged jet spray of holy excrement fired out by the fully charged weapon buff, then this list would have looked drastically different. But I feel like the only consistent way to do this is to continue with what is a very strict definition of what it takes to be a weapon buff. And to me, that is only counting the increase to holy damage given, along with the luster effect on the blades while you're attacking. Framing it this way, 70 holy damage for around 30 seconds of maximum uptime it's not spectacular. It's quite far from it, actually. Like, Death Flare can outpace that shit. Number 60, Mists of Slumber. If 15 Eternal Sleep buildup wasn't enough to sell a weapon, 20 of the normal stuff probably won't be either. Any Soporific or Eternal Sleep Grease can still eclipse its buildup amount, especially when received by weapons with innate arcane scaling, and the sword itself without the buff is already laced with 66 innate buildup, making the skill buff only useful in situations when you for sure just needed one more hit for something to happen. If you didn't score a hit with the sword swing of the skill itself, you just fucked up and might as well start looking for a window to cast it again. Number 59, Flame Skewer. Skill itself is great, the buff is not. At only 15 seconds, the Flame Skewer buff only barely competes with the elemental damage buffs given by vanilla Drawstring Greases. In fact, since it's a flat damage buff that isn't affected by anything, the buff even increases in shittiness as you place it on larger, slower weapons, which is something you should absolutely be doing, because the buff given to you after the skill concludes is barely like 5% of the reason you should be using it. Buffs like these tend to add to the personality of the weapon roster and make the combat feel a bit more alive and multifaceted, but it's difficult to imagine them serving any other purpose that isn't visual. Number 58, Vyke's Dragonbolt. Counting as both a weapon buff and a body buff, this is a large part of what makes Vyke's Dragonbolt so unstomachable to a lot of players. But the body buff can be overwritten by another body buff of your choosing to nullify the lightning defense reduction, leaving you with a weapon buff that still isn't the greatest deal on the shelf, since Electrify Armament can be scooped up from the Lanedell Knight roaming around near the Artist Shack in Liurnia, and can be revved up for 8 less FP, 8 less faith, and persists for 20 seconds longer, all for the exact same damage output. This is the only known case of color preference discrimination in the entire game, since access to the color red is more expensive for provably no reason. They should have completed the ensemble by giving us a frozen lightning incantation that still does the same damage but needs 85 faith and a donation to your nearest church. Number 57, Eternal Sleep Grease. Holy shit. Just use the pots. I feel like there's a very harsh divide between the players who swear by this status and its ability to get work done, and the players that could go their entire lives without ever seeing it again and it would still be too soon. And I think that's gonna come down to first impressions. If your first foray into the wonders of Eternal Sleep was pot crafting and the like, you probably think Eternal Sleep deserves to have a fucking museum named after it. Imagine how different your opinion would be if this item was your first exposure. You have to use one of the two ripple weapons for these to work. There's just no other way around it. You will take down entire mini-bosses with nothing but R1 spam before you proc anything without using the Ripple Axe or Halberd. If you don't care about FP expense, Mists of Eternal Sleep might even be a better choice for you in this instance. Otherwise, just use the pots. Just use regular sleep grease at that point. Number 56, Chilling Mist. That cloud at the start is doing some heavy-ass lifting. You ever do that thing where you miss on the initial swing completely and feel like a total moron, so you just try to preserve as much FP as possible and make the buff work out of spite? Yeah, don't do that. That's even stupider. Just recast it and try to hit something with a cloud again. That frost buff hands out 60 frostbite for 40 seconds, which is worse than both Frozen Armament and Freezing Grease. It can't be extended by the Old Lord Talisman since it's not a spell. It doesn't have any of the advantages that normally come with consumables like no FP cost, and it can't be improved by Arcane since it's Frostbite. This isn't even the worst of both worlds. This is just an entirely undiscovered planet. We're in some uncharted mire of mundanity where talismans don't exist and no one knows how to count past 30. Number 55 and 54, Frozen Armament and Freezing Grease. I'm not settling a debate because there is no debate to settle. Nut up, get your grimy hands on a whetstone, go for the cold infusion, and lock these two items in a box floating down the river where they fucking belong. You can decide for yourself which one is worse. I'm not helping you. The grease doesn't cost any FP to use, but you can extend the sorcery effect with Old Lord's Talisman. The advantages of either are honestly paltry and just laughably inefficient when you've got access to Hugh and his masterful fingers. That son of a bitch can stir up anything he wants. Except rot. And madness. And sleep. But he can put shit in the freezer for 30 minutes and it'll come out doing more work than whatever these two are supposed to be doing. Now I'm just imagining giving Hugh the fire whetstone or whatever, and you go to him for like a flame art affinity or something. He just gets up and there's a microwave behind him. He just like puts your katana in there for like 3 minutes like he's reheating a fucking steak. Number 53 and 52, Rot and Drawstring Rot Grease. 63 buildup that refuses to scale with anything puts it right beside the two frozen weapon buffs because I refuse to accept any perspective or line of thought that arrives at the conclusion of this being a good way to build up Rot when Rot bone arrows become readily available decently early. Most weapons with an 8 Rot buildup can't accept greases anyways. I think the only ones that can are the two duelist weapons and the Ant Spur Rapier. I think. So it's just another sleep grease situation where the amount of weapons that can actually accept it are so scarce and spaced out that structuring a build around it is just setting yourself up for headaches down the road. Scarlet Aeonia and Exike's Decay are the queen and king, while the hefty rot pots and rot bone arrows are great options for the common man. This shit doesn't even cater to a class. It's moldy tuna someone left in their car for a week and now 5 people are on a mission from God to make it look viable. Number 51, Death Flare. I'm gonna give this next one the old corporate style compliment sandwich. 65 flat holy damage gets underestimated quite often due to people forgetting this is a curved sword with an extremely fast R1 chain, which would be a feat worth celebrating had it not been paired with such a useless status ailment, agonizingly poor reach even for a curved sword, and it doing basically nothing to earn its title as one of the legendary armaments despite other equally visually stimulating legendary tier weapons like the Godslayer's Greatsword or the Blasphemous Blade being exponentially more deserving of said moniker. Alright, so I kind of fucked up the sandwich a little. It was more like a compliment pizza if each insult was a pepperoni slice. But I hope you'll order from us again soon. Don't forget to give me 5 stars on Yelp. Number 50, Festive Grease. Nope, there's nothing festive about this one at all. Farming for materials for this bitch would sooner make me feel like throwing a tantrum rather than a party. Blessed Bone Shards can only be farmed from Black Knights and Mesmer Soldiers, both with humiliatingly low drop rate. Well, okay, I mean, I guess they're not that bad. With a high enough discovery, you'll find a couple eventually. But all the other greases require easily accessible respawning materials that can easily be collected by just warping at a grace, scoping up all the shit you need, and just resetting it and running the route again. You can't do that with these. The holy damage boost is less than the new DLC greases, but with 25 runes per strike given to the player, which just comes off like a very careless attempt to indirectly buff the celebrant weapons that no one uses and will continue to not use, because if I need runes for anything in the DLC, I'll just go and run a route or something, instead of farming for materials to make the grease. It really is hilariously pointless when you think about it, because the amount of farming you'd be doing to obtain blessed bone shards would net you way more runes than you'd ever need for anything anyways, especially since scaling in the DLC is based completely off of Shadow Tree level and isn't tied to character level. Number 49, Warcry. Maybe if the visual effect itself were a bit more clear on the fact that it's a weapon buff, I wouldn't be that mad about spiking 16 more FP down the shitter just to reapply it after using a grease. I wouldn't have been mad because it wouldn't have happened. The physical damage boost is nice in earlier fights, but the meager duration and massive delay on when the altered charged R2 actually connects make it a weak choice even among other ashes of its type. Barbaric Roar comprises multiple hits in its charged R2 animation, which opens up a window for status application in addition to the damage just landing much quicker. And Braggart's Roar is just straight up more everything. Like, it's got stamina regen on it. Like, just use that. Number 48, Lightning Slash. I think just about every lightning-based weapon buff you can find in the game is mathematically better than this one. Even basic lightning grease on a random weapon has 20 more seconds of uptime with no expense to damage. Being an Ash of War means it can't be improved by Old Lord's Talisman, which is, I mean, that's fine, I expected that. The real problems I have with it are the complete absence of dexterity scaling, in addition to the Shard of Alexander only affecting the initial downward swing, and not the flat buff that comes afterwards. I'm pretty sure nothing can affect the damage on this buff, outside of like basic elemental improvements from a Scorpion Talisman or something. That's all this weapon buff has going for it. Number 47 and 46, Poison and Drawstring Poison Grease. These two get a slightly special treatment from me strictly because of one weapon it's allowed to synergize with, which is the Venomous Fang. Greasing these green bitches up with some tree herpes takes advantage of the game's inability to differentiate between certain types of poison. You see, doubling your build-up with a single item use isn't actually the main attraction of this strategy, because that 72 and 8 build-up ain't just no regular poison. That there's deadly poison, you dumb son of a bitch. Super diabetes, turbo AIDS. And since there's no way for the game to tell the difference between regular and deadly poison, the stronger poison variant will always take priority. So there's your one distinctive, ultra-specific, hair-splitting case for why poison grease doesn't actually gargle copious amounts of cock like most of its cousins. I don't have anything else for it. The build-up amount is still pretty terrible, and being a grease means it doesn't scale with anything unless you're packing a ripple weapon. So unless you're a Venomous Fang build, then you can just go on ahead and get fucked, I guess. Number 45, Poison Armament. The incantation gives you 70 build-up instead of the 63 from poison grease with the same duration as the grease. The ways in which it scales is straight up identical to the grease scaling, which is that it can only buff specific weapons, and ideally those that already have an 8 poison buildup, like the Venomous Fang and that's it, I guess. I can't think of anything else. Which means we've officially looped all the way back to the reset frostbite of this video, which is either throw this bitch on one of the 2 ripple weapons, or the Venomous Fang, or leave it alone forever and go with the poison infusion instead. Why the hell did I give this its own section? Number 44, Hone Blade. Alright, everyone put your pencils down. Stop theory crafting, I figured out how it works. So if you've ever healed yourself a seemingly random amount of HP upon sharpening the blade in the middle of combat, this here is gonna be why. Normally, hits with this weapon will replenish only 1% of your max HP per hit, and using the skill will double the amount restored for 40 seconds. But looking at how the effect actually works, it doesn't really double the healing output. More accurately, the healing is duplicated. If you slap something 9 times with the axe without using the skill, you'll be restoring health equal to 9% of your max HP when honing the blade. I don't know how this script itself really works behind the curtain, but my working explanation is that each of those previous hits were stored somewhere in your character's balls or whatever, and upon activating the skill, it's observed by something that 9 hits have already been calculated with the axe. So the game just says, fuck it, give him 9% more HP. Might be an error, might not, I don't really care. But it makes the skill itself pretty nice as a support utility, which is great because it can't really do anything else. Number 43, Regal Roar. Against crowds of enemies, those charged heavies will clear any room you need them to, like hygiene security at a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament. The timeless, tried and true countermeasure against sudden, unexpected claustrophobia. The Stomp AoE might completely miss half the time, but at least you're not being surrounded by anything. Additionally, since it's a weapon buff attached to a skill and not the skill itself, this picky bitch rejects just about every talisman you throw at it. And unfittingly enough, that includes the Godfrey icon, Roar Medallion, and 2-handed Enchanted Sword Talisman. Shattered Stone doesn't even boost the stomp either. Like, what the fuck, man? Every time the skill makes it somewhere on a list, I feel like we have to just put everything down and spend an entire paragraph refreshing ourselves on what it can and can't work with. And on a buff this inconsistent, it might be more worth it if we just skip it completely and toss a Barbaric Roar on a fist weapon or something. Number 42, Blood Grease. It's just like, you ever see an item that's so almost good that it just pisses you off? I've gotten to where I just pity seeing this item try so hard and yield ultimately little results. Unlike its drawstring cousin, the full minute duration at least guarantees that I'll be able to do something with it once. It so badly wants to carve out a specific niche for arcane scaling weapons, but the only two weapons with innate arcane scaling that can accept Grief's buffs are the two ripple weapons. The only other place it's allowed to perform is when applied to weapons that already have innate bleed buildup like katanas and claws. Granted, the pool of weapons this applies to is vastly larger than anything with innate poison or rot or anything else, but even still, you're probably better off going with the bleed or occult infusions like 80% of the time. The only reason I can think of for why infusions wouldn't be the ideal choice would be if you didn't feel like sacrificing all the attack power. Players who swear by these kinds of buffs are hilarious to listen to.
No, seriously, it's broken. You just have to limit your entire playstyle to a single weapon type
without infusing it or building around anything else, and ignoring 20 other bleed-related buffs and abilities designed specifically to eclipse it later on. Number 41, Drawstring Soporific Grease. You're giving up 45 seconds of total uptime for an extra 9 base buildup compared to the regular Grease. This is a buff that's, once again, only scalable with 2 weapons in the whole game, and this item thinks it's in the position to be negotiating shit. Sleep already tends to build up at a noticeably slower rate than other ailments, except maybe bleed, but when looking at the raw data, sleep greases just return lower numbers across the board. This also means the buildup margin between this and regular Soporific Grease will be smaller than, say, poison or rot. Drawstring Rot, for instance, is capable of 80 buildup, 17 more than the standard. That's already not great considering its uptime, but Drawstring Soporific Grease only leads the regular Grease by 9, raising the question, is this small of a gap really worth such a large hit to total uptime? But I'm still placing this a few notches above the Rot Greases because I think Sleep is just a better status when it works. Number 40, Flaming Strike. The weapon Ash itself does plenty of work, probably more than I'll ever be able to properly nail down in a single paragraph. But the subsequent weapon buff upon successful execution of the Ash is something I can't fully subscribe to, which is perfectly normal and okay. The skill is obviously already in close contact with some of the nation's finest roid suppliers, so the buff itself doesn't really have any expectations to measure up to or anything. If you've gotten to the buff, you've already accomplished more than enough for 14 FP, but it's like a final goodbye present from the Ash for using their services. Like the weapon Ash did its work and now it's sending you a postcard from Italy or some shit in the form of a 40-second fire buff. The flat damage bonus is only 5 more than what you would see on vanilla elemental greases that last 20 seconds longer and aren't stingy with your FP. So weapon skill aside, the buffing choice here remains pretty obvious. Number 39, Flame Spear. 5 more damage than the aforementioned, and with an identical 40-second duration. I was actually a little disappointed here since the visual effect of the buff is obviously a Messmerfire effect that should be boosted by placing it on a Fire Knight weapon. I think. It better, but I was getting more damage with just standard-ass daggers. I feel like the 95 damage should be heightened just a little bit if it's attached to a Fire Knight weapon, since that interaction already exists with Messmerfire Grease.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which a storyteller gives...
Because without that, it just ends up being another paltry damage buff that's forced into mediocrity that I can't even say doesn't make sense or isn't balanced, because it's attached to one of the strongest weapon ashes in the game. Number 38 through 35, the Holy Magic, Fire, and Lightning Greases. Alright, physical inspection time, gentlemen. Please take 2 steps forward and remain behind the red line. You two in the back.
Huh?
What do you do?
I look pretty.
Absolutely fucking nothing. Cool. At least you can die with honor. Yeah, I don't have the attention span to write a whole fucking bit for this. Number 34 and 33, Dragonwound and Dragon Communion Grease. Man, I love lathering up a spear with this and then watching a Ghostflame dragon have a bitch fit for 60 seconds. It's like some unseen line of code takes into account specifically when I use Dragonwound Grease. That just tells whatever I'm locked onto to suddenly start throwing a tantrum like a 3-year-old spilling his drink at Burger King. You would only ever throw this on if you're fighting dragons, and fighting dragons with a full melee melee build, it sucks. It sucks voluminous amounts of ass, and I hate thinking about it. That's not the buff's fault, mind you. It's nobody's fault that their one strongest skill set they've cultivated in life just gets T-boned by miscellaneous environmental factors. I feel bad placing these two items this low because I know how useful they can be if placed on weapons with excellent reach like the pike, but I'm never in a healthy mindset when I throw this on. I'm not thinking about how much Fortisac's ass I'm gonna be slapping by making my hands 30% bigger. I'm always like, hell yeah, this dumb bitch fight's gonna be over 30% quicker and I can continue playing the fucking game. And that's just, I feel like that's not a good spot to be in. Like as a buff, as a boss fight, as a state of mind, anything. Number 32.5, Golden Temp. Okay, so son of a bitch. I completely forgot the skill existed until I went back and read another script of mine and just stumbled across it. And I already made all the assets and everything, and this shit needs to come out like now because I'm very impatient and there's a fucking sponsor attached to this video anyway, so it's not like I can postpone it. So here's why I'm putting Golden Tempering way above Festive Grease, like way, like easily 2 tiers above it. It buffs both weapons at once. That 100 holy damage gets added as a flat value, and since straight swords already have a faster R1 chain than most weapons to begin with, the holy buff on both weapons, in addition to the altered R2 attack, spanks ass like it's trying to make a sloppy Joe out of freshly pounded grave duelist's butt cheeks. And I didn't realize until typing that sentence that it's one of the most ambiguous compliments I've ever given something. It could mean amazing, it could mean absolute shite, who knows? Well, in this case I think it's the first one, and it's only a shame that the weapon itself gets so egregiously left behind by anything you're given past the first 2 main areas of the game, because the buff by itself is some tasty ass gravy. Sometimes. Number 32, Soporific Grease. There's no way soporific is a real word. It sounds like a cartoon mascot trying to sell you a cereal. I guess there's no denying the ridiculousness of calling it sleep grease, but you obviously had a thesaurus right in front of you, and you couldn't have thought of a cooler sounding word for freezing? Man, the English language is a fucking scam. Sleep is a very tactical status to inflict on something. They may not always pass out completely, but those with resistance to it can still be rendered immobile for a couple seconds, which is more than enough time for at least one fully charged R2, which will lead to a poise break in almost any context on a large enough weapon. And at least for this specific purpose, Eternal Sleep affords you no critical advantage over the standard fix. In fact, the regular Soporific Grease items offer more build-up on average anyway, since the game just looks at it as an inferior version of sleep. Number 31, Shriek of Milos. Okay, explaining why this barely made it into the top half of the whole list is gonna feel like dissecting a fucking pig, but hopefully you'll hear me out. The weapon buff comprises a very specific part of the weapon skill that, when compartmentalized and separated from everything else, is just Barbaric Roar with... Actually, no, that's it. It's just Barbaric Roar. Same duration, same attack MVs, same everything. The debuff, in my opinion, is honestly the main event. It's what you should be using the skill for in the first place, because that's 15% more damage versus anything you want, compared to a 7.5% increase to only physical damage, and a strength scaling modifier on a greatsword that prefers dex. Using the multi-hit charged R2 can stack up bleed in a way that's at least passable, but Barbaric Roar can be used with all infusions, so you can just slap that on a Blood Affinity Greatstars and enjoy a nice little health leech bonus on top of your bitch baby ass bleed build salad. Number 30, Sacred Blade. Resident Evil and Left 4 Dead were some of my favorite games growing up, so re-deadening the undead is expectedly a very cathartic pastime of mine. My ever-growing animosity for Ghostflame dragons could be enough to generate its own electricity, but I still think 90 flat holy damage for only 40 seconds is far from optimal given your selection during the post-game, especially when Sacred Order gives me a 10% damage buff that carries over to spells and even the weapon I'm power stancing it with, in addition to double damage versus undead. If you really hate Ghostflame dragons that much, there are plenty of better ways to punish them. Number 29, Bloodflame Blade. I've really come around to tolerating a lot of this incantation's shortcomings, but being invaluable on RL1 runs and challenges still only covers a fairly small subpopulation of players that would even be interested in attempting it in the first place. Nowadays, most people seem to be gravitating towards one-shot builds, and this newfangled fix the kids have been getting into called an all-hit run. Easily the biggest turnoff for me here is the 7-second duration, which means once you slap this thing on, a full-ass 5-alarm warning should be screaming in your head saying, hit something. now. I think the utility it brings is fine. I think the FP cost is fine, but 7 seconds just leaves way too much room for shit to go wrong. A horned warrior could zip in from off screen and suplex the shit out of you, and by the time you've finished digging up your spine out of the ground, the buff has already expired and you'll need to recast it again. Number 28, Flare O Serpent. I'm just surprised Shard of Alexander actually improves something on the explosion. This might be one of the only cases where something tied to a weapon buff actually gets boosted by it. Only other case I can think of would be Moonlight Greatsword. It's 90 more fire damage for 30 seconds, so a lot of its value, not counting the Boomhammer-esque explosion triggered when it hits the floor, is going to come from how fast you can attack with the weapon when the buff is active. And the R1 chain is, well, I mean, it's a flail. It's not the fastest R1 chain in the business, but it's way more than enough for me to make a judgment call on if it's worth 8 FP, and it absolutely is. 8 FP for a buff of this potency it's honestly pretty nuts. For reference, Flaming Strike needs 14 FP in total, Flame Spear needs 19, and Flame Skewer needs 18 despite it only lasting 15 seconds. This is a nice way of measuring how much the game thinks the initial attack on the skill itself is really worth, because you can see it reflected in numbers like this. Since this weapon skill, for instance, is just a buff that doesn't really come with its own attack or anything at the beginning, it makes sense that it would cost a lower amount of FP. Number 27, Thunderstorm. I've been trying to decide this whole video whether or not being a unique weapon buff should count towards its final placing on the list, and I think I accidentally made that decision already when I was talking about Shriek of Milos, so it's whatever. I guess I'll just stay consistent with that. Just about every single shortcoming I can think of for this particular skill is the weapon it's permanently glued to. I love the fact that I'm able to have single button access to 120 extra lightning damage with a reasonable duration that always helps out at least a little. I would just love it a bit more if that damage could be funneled into a weapon that could use it better, and maybe had an animation string that didn't make me want to headbutt a moving ceiling fan. Number 26. Poisonous Mist. Being an Ash of War means it doesn't come with the outrageous deficiency you find on Greases and Incantations, which is that it has synergy with infused weapons, obviously, since it's an Ash of War. And that also means both the Poison Mist Cloud at the beginning and the subsequent weapon buff are both massively affected by the weapon's arcane scaling, and therefore your arcane level. This is the main reason why you see a chorus of responses saying to infuse when someone talks about Grease items in forums. The cloud lingers for quite a bit after the attack animation is finished, making it not only incredibly difficult to miss with it, but the buildup of the buff only trails the Grease by 3, and that's without taking into account any arcane scaling whatsoever. On a build that's actually suited for it, you may not even need the buff most of the time. But if you're fighting something that has trouble sitting still, just 3 or so hits on your average straight sword is enough to successfully proc most bosses. Number 25 and 24, Electrify Armament and Scholar's Armament. Lumping these in with each other because aside from their damage type and FP cost, there is no noticeable difference in how they work. Exact same duration, exact same added damage per hit, and even the animations themselves are of very similar length. Electrify Armament needs 2 more FP and 3 more of the appropriate stat before it starts revving up, and admittedly you do get the Scholar buff way earlier than Electrify Armament. So despite one damage type just being more coveted overall and definitely more valuable towards later parts of the game, I think Scholar's Armament still just barely edges ahead due to its slightly friendlier stat benchmark and ease of access. Number 23, Bloodflame Blade. Okay, so this forced me to move around the entire bottom half of the list, because once I started seriously looking at what this incantation could do, I was forced to admit to myself that Blood Grease wasn't actually that bad. I mean, it's still bad, but it used to be like at 57 compared to where it was. Bloodflame Blade still suffers from the same fault as Blood Grease, which is only being viable on weapons that already have innate bleed, but it doesn't feel like I'm trying to make the buff tolerable. It doesn't have the same sensation of forcing down a moldy Brussels sprout sandwich by dousing it in ketchup. This is more like finding out you can put barbecue sauce on ribs. Like, oh shit, okay, so this is what I'm supposed to do. It makes katanas and claws even stupider and more brain dead than they already were as weapon classes, and it also has some pretty nice synergy with twin blades and even daggers like the Great Knife. If you're looking to fully commit to either one or the other, you have more viable options for both fire damage and bleed buildup, but there's something about that slow, over time buildup effect on Bloodflame Bloodflame Blade that just hits very different once you try it out. Number 22, Drawstring Eternal Sleep Grease. Speaking strictly on drawstring buffs, I think we've just about hit the ceiling. Many variables and extenuating circumstances have combined their powers to force this grease into an honestly very favorable spot, miles above its neighbors. Firstly, now that string is purchasable in the DLC, the craftables required to make this item are decently accessible. Second, the amount of buildup in between sleep greases are much lower on average, and so that leaves less room to stand out when considering a particular item. Third, the length of the new drawstring greases in the DLC have been given a generous duration boost of up to 25 seconds, nearly half the amount of regular grease buffs. And fourth, and most importantly, there is zero tactical difference between standard and eternal sleep when inflicting the status on resistant enemies. This little gathering of insignificant facts just sounds like the trivia section on the back of a cereal box or something, but those 4 bullet points become the fucking Beatles when talking about this item. Like it just accidentally stumbled its way into the top half of the list and ends up as one of the best status buffs you could ever consider. Number 21 through 18, the DLC Elemental Greases. Bigger baddies means bigger weapons means bigger numbers means bigger grease buffs. And unlike the drawstring items in the DLC, it's not the duration that's affected, but instead its overall damage. 120 damage per strike this time, instead of just the usual 85. So, weapons that hit fast and frequently benefit even further. This seemingly traditional lineup of greases has also sent me into a downward spiral that has me questioning everything I know about how elemental damage works in this game. Okay, so please allow me to correct a bit of misinformation contained in past videos when I said Messmerfire Grease, when applied to a Fire Knight weapon, will result in a higher damage output than normal. I said this because that is the info contained in the fucking description. I can now verify this to be not just completely untrue, but so untrue that when messing around with numbers in the params, I could not get Messmerfire Grease to deal better damage on the Fire Knight's Greatsword, no matter what. So check this shit out. This is a damage comparison between a normal Fire Knight's Greatsword and a modified Zweihander. I chose to modify the Zweihander's damage because I was too afraid of potentially canceling the effect had I messed around with the Fire Knight's Greatsword, so I instead copied all the damage numbers and scaling from the Fire Knight's Greatsword over to the Zweihander and had them dealing the exact same amount of damage to this Leyndell Knight. I even changed the amount of fire damage supplied by regular fire grease to that of Messmerfire Grease, so that if such an interaction between this item and this sword existed, it would be clearly visible. And it wasn't. It wasn't, and they both handed out the same amount of damage every single time I tested it. So then I decided, well, okay, the description specifically states flame imbuement, so maybe the effect carries over to regular fire grease as well. So I set all my target's defenses to 0 and all of its elemental damage negations to 1. I then replaced my Messmerfire Grease with standard magic grease and lowered the fire grease value back to its usual 85. And after testing with this lineup, I'm losing my shit. I've had it with this. Same damage. Exact same damage. What? Why does this keep being an issue? You can't say shit in item descriptions and will it into existence. Math must be involved. Holy fuck. Number 17, Orders Blade. I have a fucking headache. Functionally, this is just a Holy Golden Shower variant of Scholars and Electrify, but with the additional bonus of inflicting double damage against anything with a visible skeleton. And Gravebirds, I guess, since they're like made of stone or whatever. I thought I was onto something with that description, but I guess that's not completely accurate. Everything with a visible skeleton and or shoots flaming skulls at your nope, fuck, record exists. Am I dwelling on this too much? Order's Blade has rapidly become one of my favorite buffing incantations because every little positive about it adds up along the way. Needs less FP than its lightning and magic counterparts, the stat requirements aren't a hassle, and it gives you the bonus damage against undead without sacrificing any of its flat damage or duration. This is no longer yesterday's Order's Blade. We're looking at a truly inspiring transformation compared to what it used to be, and it doesn't even feel like anything changed that much about it. It's almost like I was full of shit 2 years ago and rated this incantation incorrectly or something. Nah, that can't be it. There's no way. Number 16 and 15, Royal Knight's Resolve and Determination. To a noticeably lesser extent, but this is another set of weapon buffs that can have the same problem as Bloodflame Blade, which is every now and then your target might launch into a 29-hit showstopper combo like they're auditioning for Dancing with the Fucking Stars and eat up the entire 10-second window to deal damage, but a bit of foresight can fix that no problem, I guess. Which one you prefer is mostly going to be up to how much FP you're willing to spend on it. Repeated use of Resolve can flush your blue juice pretty fast if you aren't paying attention, and 20% more of a damage multiplier versus Determination ends up only being around 12.5% more damage in practice because of how math and percentages work. So, purely for the sake of FP efficiency, I might have to decide with Determination just a slight bit, but they're honestly functionally like the exact same. If your build can spare the FP and you would rather use Resolve, it'll definitely finish fights quicker. Number 14 through 11, the DLC Drawstring Elemental Greases. Drawstring Greases in the DLC have been not only directly buffed due to the new durations being longer than the vanilla variants, but also indirectly buffed due to players now having immediate access to string, and just for bonus points, the difference in duration between status greases and damage greases are no longer there. It's all just 25 seconds. Thanks to the materials being easier to access, I'm now convinced this is just 15 extra damage with no drawback, and the additional benefit of the buffing animation being like 10 times quicker. There's nothing really stopping you from just hoarding a shitload of string and making as many of the same grease as you can carry, and as long as you're heading out with a decent handful, the buff can be reapplied so quickly that the shorter duration almost just doesn't matter. Number 10, Sacred Order. Is it misleading to label this a weapon buff? I would say so, because it's the only weapon buff that comes to mind that buffs not only your weapon and not only all holy damage, but all damage dealt by your character, period. Including sorceries, including incantations, including the damage of the weapon in your other hand. Just a fat-ass 10% holiday bonus to every single speck of damage your character is capable of shitting out. And the double damage against undead carries over in the same way. In terms of stackability, this might be one of the most versatile weapon buffs you can possibly get your hands on. Because being a weapon buff means it can freely stack with Golden Vow, FGMS, Rallying Standard, just all the greats. Just line them up and get them all in here. Everyone's invited. Bring your friends. I know I've never been one to consider effects with a very specific niche as titans of the industry or any of that bullshit, but this really had me rethinking my position on that. I've undersold Last Rites massively, and I'm surprised so few people brought it up. I don't even think deleting is a strong enough word for what this weapon buff does to undead enemies. This isn't just a death bird deleter. This takes the words death and bird and removes them from the goddamn dictionary. Number 9, Shriek of Sorrow. The effect ladder that makes this one pop used to be very confusing to such an extent that I just stayed away from it. But once I learned how it really worked, it became a mainstay in almost every casual build I made. The way the buff interacts with the player's health is what sells the effect. Since it buffs your damage based on your remaining health in that very moment, you can whip this out at around half health and receive a 20% bonus to damage, and then heal yourself back up to full, and it still keeps the 20% boost. The only exception to this is the very last tier that activates at 30% HP, which is the 25% damage boost. Healing anywhere past this amount of HP will just bring the boost back to 20%. That's in addition to increasing the base strength scaling of your weapon by 5 points. Not exactly good enough to make up for the 5% damage difference, but I'm sure you can stack a bunch of other stupid shit on top of it too to heighten the boost even further. Number 8, Barbaric Roar. Hands down, the highlight of the weapon buff here is the altered R2 animation. The strength scaling and physical damage improvements are also useful, but by themselves, it just doesn't feel like a complete buff. This altered R2 is what turns Barbaric Roar into the workhorse we know it as. It's what allows good status buildup to be just as achievable on Colossals as it is with smaller weapons. And since it can be used on any affinity, you also gain access to a Colossal-sized buildup number when going for the status infusions, which, in case you haven't fucked around with before, end up being some of the stupidest numbers in the entire game, period. I'm talking like hefty pot levels of status being handed out by this R2. It still works with Roar Medallion, it can go on just about any weapon you'd want it to, and it continues to hard carry many strength and status builds into the DLC even today. Number 7, Seppuku. Looking at this weapon Ash was a neat little retrospective into how the game used to work, because if it hadn't received the nerfs that it did, I'm pretty sure this would have escalated into someone being physically assaulted. Could you imagine 84 base buildup on this mother of a bitch with only 10% HP loss? This already synergizes with one of the most powerful talismans in the game, the White Mask, and the Sacred Bloody Flesh item, all of which are allowed to stack with each other. And we used to be tossing around numbers like 84? As a base? It's no wonder this has garnered the reputation it has. Before 1.07, this is the kind of weapon ash you would have attempted Steam refund runs with. The 30 extra physical damage barely even fucking matters. Like, it actually pisses me off. As if scalable bleed buildup somehow wasn't enough to make it stand out. What's it doing here? It doesn't scale with anything. Just take it off. The obvious highlight of the ash is the status, and the attack boost you get from everything I mentioned earlier completely eclipses the flat damage like 50 times over. It's stupid. It was sledgehammered back in 1.07, and it's still just stupid strong. Number 6. Ruinous Ghostflame. This weapon buff climbed way higher than I would have expected. The FP cost is surprisingly cheap, at least compared to other weapon buffs of its caliber, but I think the point of interest here is that it's one of the only weapon buffs that end up being great at both damage and status application. I could probably make an entire compilation of parts and other videos where I've complained about this, but usually when things in this game try to split down two different roads like this, it just winds up in a position where it sucks at doing both. Ruinous Ghostflame is, it's not that. Like, it is pretty decisively not that. That issue is nowhere near this weapon. 110 magic damage brings it into direct competition with the DLC's Elemental Greases, and the extra 80 Frostbite just pushes it into another league altogether. It did take a couple buffs for it to get there, but it eventually found its way to the top. Every time I go back and research these, I'm just reminded of how controversial patch 1.07 really was back in the day. Like, this shit changed everything in the game, and I feel like barely anyone remembers how or why. Number 5, the Dragon Halberd's Spinning Slash. And if you agreed with the placement of Ruinous Ghostflame, then allow me to present the next objective step up in that ladder. The Dragon Halberd's Spinning Slash, capable of 160 base lightning damage and 80 frostbite buildup. And that much damage this early into the game is... That's a decision. That's a decision, alright. It sure is one of them. In case you weren't aware, the Spinning Slash weapon skill by itself already hands out enough damage and poise break on larger weapons to be considered one of the titans. But the lightning buff gets applied right at the very beginning of the skill, just freely distributing all that extra damage into the whole combo, resulting in almost twice the damage you'd see from the weapon skill normally. This also means you needn't initiate the follow-up attack for the buff. It gets applied during the first half of the Spinning Slash, allowing it to be notably cheaper than other weapon buffs in its class, while doing the insane amount of legwork it already does. Number 4, Ice Lightning Sword. Okay, we were in stupid territory before, and now we're just turning into downright fucking fools. Aside from costing 8 additional FP compared to its Halberd variant, there is nothing. There is no downside or some random fly in the ointment that comes with using this over the Spinning Slash buff. It's the same exact buff that works the same exact way, to such an extent that they didn't even bother to make a separate effect ID for it. This ultimately means when placed on the katana, you're just going to be dealing the damage and status that much quicker. Katanas already have one of the snappiest R1 animation chains of any weapon class, and Ice Lightning Sword outright abuses that privilege. Number 3, Cragblade. Shield builders? Y'all are a bunch of fucking pussies. Does this sound like something you'd yell at your monitor after an hour or two in the good old Coliseum? Do you find your entire day ruined by an extremely specific piece of imagery embossed on a giant stone slab, slowly replaced with intrusive thoughts that involve somehow finding the last player you battled with and dragging a hot iron across the friction ridges of their ballsack? Well, don't do that, you fucking sociopath. The hell's wrong with you? Just slam your favorite armament into the ground like you're aggressively throwing down a barbell at the gym, and you've got one of the greatest poise munchers this side of the galaxy. 15% more physical damage, and 10% more poise damage, which is just cozy as fuck on great hammers, and pairing the hammer talisman with the additional 50% stamina damage can result in some real side splitters against big shielders like Grafted Scions and Crucible Knights. What this does to shields could be considered a hate crime. Like, fuck jumping attacks, just pump a couple basic R1s into someone's knees and let the buff take the wheel from there. Number 2, Braggart's Roar. Shotgun buffs have never been my thing. This is not that. This is a very coordinated and purposeful set of bonuses that are made to be as flexible as possible. This is not a shotgun buff. This is the motherfucking battle rifle from Halo 3. Braggart's Roar is the only weapon buff in the game that delivers not only a straightforward damage increase, but a damage negation buff and a stamina regen buff. This kind of versatility is usually pretty pretty common on body and aura buffs like Golden Vow and Rallying Standard, boosting both attack and damage reduction, or Sacred Bloody Flesh giving you some arcane with an additional attack boost if something bleeds, but this is significantly less common on weapon buffs. The closest we ever get to this level of flexibility is buffs that are just really good at dealing damage and status at the same time. Nearly everything special about it can just be abbreviated down to a single sentence. It's a weapon buff. If it were a body buff, it would need to compete frequently with other buffs that are just flat out better. But since it's tied to your weapon, you can stack the damage reduction with damage reduction body buffs, the stamina regen with other stamina regen buffs, and if that's not enough, you can be serving fuckers a juicy charbroiled double patty Braggart melt on power stance builds because this son of a bitch stacks with itself. Number 1. Moonlight Greatsword. It's of paramount importance to the team that all their IPs can be remotely tied to some sort of theme, just in case Sony starts drafting up a roadmap for the FromSoft cinematic universe. And the theme they've stuck to since their Kingsfield days seems to be massive blue triangle that shits moon lasers and plays the game for you. This is the FromSoft-ified Infinity Gauntlet. It's the only weapon buff that comes with its own projectiles that do their own damage and status buildup, making it one of the most unique weapon buffs available since it's not just a glowy visual effect that gives you more status. It's like switching from luxury to sport mode. It's almost an entirely different weapon. Those moon blades are capable of punching fuckers with 24 poise damage if fully charged. The frostbite buildup can shoot up to around 170 per charged heavy if the sword connects as well. It's shaking hands with nearly half the game's entire lineup of buffs and bonuses, including Shard of Alexander, which is almost never the case for weapon buffs, and the unique synergy it has with Blessed Blue Dew allows it to be cast completely for free. As long as you have 32 FP on you at any given time, you have enough to just lean on that L2 like it's your fucking therapist.
You need proper punishment.